Today the Mentoring Triangle is going to be reflecting on the interview that we conducted with British and Irish Lions rugby legend Richard Hill a few weeks ago. And Steve Turner and Julian Powell will be sharing a conversation with me about the themes which have emerged from Richard's wonderful interview. If it's okay with you guys, I'd just like to start with one thing, is every time I'm in Richard's company, I find it almost impossible to acknowledge I'm in the company of one of the great sportsmen. He's just such a humble individual, incredibly understated guy. And I feel it's a real privilege not only to have him work with us at London County, but also to call him a friend. And I think he's just such a wonderful human being.
Yeah. So strong for me. I mean, here is a man I admired who was one of the best back row forwards that ever has been, won the World Cup with England. And you get that real sense of humility, don't you, Basil? And what I felt listening to him was as he looked back to his career, through his career, he didn't once talk about triumph or victory or brilliance. He talked above all about challenges and how he'd worked through them. So whether that was not being picked, not coming off the bench when he was under 16, or being told he didn't have mental capacity to be an international rugby player, those are the things he talked about. And I noticed, I don't know whether you are feeling the same, I noticed two things that he seemed to do all the time in his career. One was reflect, I've learned this and I turn it into action. Someone's told me this about mental capacity, I'm not sure about my fitness, I need to change, I'm going out in the evening. So reflecting but turning it into purposeful action. And the other thing was responsibility. He talked about that explicitly, but he modelled it all the way through his career, didn't he? So before he went on that Lions tour, he took responsibility for being the jumper at the back and really practicing. I was really struck by those two things, reflection into action and that sense of responsibility for his own development. It was very striking.
He talked about coming through disappointment, didn't he, and using that. Something we talk about quite a lot, coming through highs and lows, and very much using disappointment as a driver for making decisions in his life. That was another thing. He talked about responsibility. Yeah. He talked about key decision points, didn't he? Yes. Where he took that responsibility and decided, for example, I'm going to use that gap to differentiate myself from my rivals in the back row, so I'm going to make myself more likely to be selected, and that proved to be correct. Other people might just have thought, I'll make sure I'm fit, but to make that decision to differentiate himself. And he also talked again about understanding difference and diversity. So again, he made some things different about himself in the way he played, but values other young people as well and what makes them different and individual. So very impressive.
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of things that really stood out for me in addition to the points that you've made. One was the acknowledgement that if you're going to be an achiever at anything, the leadership comes from within. Yes. The drive has to be in you. But also the value of being part of high quality peer learning. So within that World Cup group, the fact that there were so many individuals who had a potential claim on wearing the shirt was that they were going to do absolutely everything individually within their power to ensure that they won a shuttle test, a bench press test, a sprint test, a skill test, and they knew that if they weren't selected, that the individual who did get selected wasn't going to give the shirt up easily. So that kind of cooperative competitiveness within that peer group, I think, sort of drove standard, which obviously made life a lot easier for Sir Clive Woodward as the cultural leader of the group. Yeah. So that's one thing that really stood out for me. But the other one was more to do with how Richard has adapted to his life beyond professional rugby, because that transition beyond sport is a very difficult one to make. And the fact that he acknowledged that he had to learn new skills in terms of understanding the people who he was going to be supporting in terms of their development. And the fact that he acknowledged that the age group that he's working with, 16 to 23, they are going to make mistakes. And the boundaries that you put in place, people are going to fall outside them. Rather than punishing people, acknowledge that that's part of the learning process. But the key thing is how you put people back together again. after that. So I think there was a real understanding of others, but also a real sensitivity.
But you're absolutely right. And the thing that I thought, you always mentioned it in passing, what I said earlier about, he recognises that people are different. That even though, because he's been there and done it, he said, but I don't quite know how to convey it, because I did it my way. And he's found his own Richard Hill way. Well, you can't, impart was the word he used, isn't it, in the video? How do you impart something that's unique to you? So I think that's helped him to be quite humble, and as a coach mentor, to work with other people where they're coming from, what their skills are, their aspirations, not turn them into mini Richard Hills, which is never going to work. But it must be very tempting for someone who comes from that position of such success to think, do it the way I've done it. And of course that's not his approach at all. And I think that's very kind of reassuring and quite inspiring that he has that necessary humility, lack of arrogance and interest in other people, that he wants to help them be great.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that helps him to build such deep trust with people. We talk about low self-orientation as being one of the key factors in terms of building deep trust with people. And some of the informality through those fishing trips that he creates, and just being a friend to people, but acknowledging that there has to be a professional boundary and that it's not about being somebody's mate. To be somebody's professional friend, then you have to have their best interests at heart, and occasionally that's about giving people some tough news and actually holding up the mirror around the stuff which is less attractive for people to look at.
You can't imagine him colluding with someone. It'd be...
He understands boundaries.
Yes, yeah. And of course we talked about, in a number of these conversations we talk about boundaries, don't we? And how people, some understand those and others don't. Like the Pardew's of this world.
Yeah, well I think Richard is a great example of somebody who has really understood the benefits that sport has played in his life in terms of his own personal development, not just through the friendships and the living he's created, but he's acknowledged that there have been lessons available to learn through being aspirational in sport, but also working collaboratively with people to achieve something. And obviously, everyone will talk about the Rugby World Cup win in 2003, but the fact that he still highlights some of the wonderful achievements that he was part of with his friends through school and some of the early Saracens experiences he had. But I think, just to finish up this sort of reflection on Richard's contribution to our work, I think there's really one overarching piece for me, and it's that Richard spoke about when he started playing professional rugby, people had brought leadership qualities to the team from outside sport and brought them into rugby. Whereas now with professional sport, people are having to learn their leadership in rugby and almost learn it on the job. And the acknowledgement that that was difficult for them to do. So I think it highlights for me one of the phenomena that exists in professional sport today, that there is a real need for sports people and coaches not to stay inside that protected bubble. And I don't just mean go on away days to meet people and go to another environment for a day, but actually spend committed time in other environments, because that's where I think potentially the real growth can occur.
Yes, absolutely.